Welcome to our channel Elimika Mtandaoni. We are in the 12th episode of the research process, and today we'll be explaining about quantitative data analysis. So we'll talk about how we can analyze and interpret quantitative data. Now let's have an introduction of what we are going to explain. We all know what statistics is. Statistics can be something which is challenging, but calculating statistics is the only one step in the process of analyzing data. So data analysis, in fact, is the process whereby we do a kind of systematic application of statistical or logical techniques so that we can describe, we can illustrate, we can condense and recap and evaluate data. So statistics is a very important subject here, so that we can learn how to analyze data. In research, once data has been collected, the step that follows is to get insights from the data. It is how researchers go from massive collection of data to a meaningful insights from the data that we have collected in the last episode that we explained about data collection. Then you collect that data and you transform that data to have a meaningful insights. As you are doing that, you will be applying what we call statistical techniques or logical techniques. So there are a number of steps. in the process of quantitative data analysis. Those steps include preparing data for analysis. As the process of preparing data for analysis involves determining how to assign some numerical scores to the data. We say scoring the data. Then the same process of preparing data for analysis, then you assess the types of scores to be used. Then you select a statistical program that you can use to do the analysis. Then you input data in that computer program. After that, you clean up the database for analysis. This is followed by another major step that is called data analysis. As you conduct a descriptive analysis of the data. You report measures of central tendencies and variations. Then you conduct a more sophisticated inferential analysis to test the hypothesis, and you examine your confidence intervals and the effect of sizes. After the process of data analysis, then you report the results that are found using things like tables, figures, and discussion of the key results. After that, you do the interpretation of the results from the data analysis. In here, you summarize the results, you compare the results with the past literature and the theories, advancing the limitations of the study, and ending with the suggestions of for the future research. So those are the steps while you are doing quantitative data analysis. So we pass through one step after another until the end of this episode. You will learn how you can prepare data for analysis. You will learn how you can do data analysis, the descriptive analysis and the inferential analysis. You will learn how you can report results and interpret such results. So starting with the preparing data for analysis. As you say, you are preparing data for analysis means you organize such data so that they can be analyzed. So in this way, what researcher does, it does what we call scoring the data and creating what we call a codebook. Then you determine the types of scores that can be used. Then you select a computer program and input data into the program. Afterwards, you clean the data. So what is scoring the data? Scoring the data means that a researcher assigns a kind of numerical scores or values to each response or category for each question. Here you have your research instruments. Let's say you have a questionnaire, then that questionnaire consists of a number of questions. For example, you can have this one question maybe in your questionnaire. You are asking your participants to tick one of the following choices. You say, for example, you say system has good user interface. An information system has a good user interface. For example, you are doing a research on a particular information system. You want to see if users are satisfied with that information system or not. So one among the questions could be the information system has a good user interface. Then you provide choices for your participants. Choices could be strongly agree, undecided, disagree, and strongly disagree. So by saying that you are scoring the data means that you assign some numerical values in these choices. You assign some numerical values. As you can see here, we say that this strongly agree is given the value of 5, agree is given the value of 4, and decided is given the value of 3, disagree is given the value of 2, and strongly disagree is given the value of 1. So that is what it means by scoring the data. So to analyze the data, you will need to assign these scores to responses as we have seen there. So there are some guidelines that we should follow as we are assigning numbers to these response options. There are a number of guidelines. One, if you are dealing with the continuous options such as, let's say, interval scales, then you should consistently score data each question in this scale using some numbering system. If you are dealing with the continuous scales, then assign them with some numbering system that like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. But for categorical scales, or for categorical values, what level are you, what you do is you assign some arbitrary number that make sense. For example, you have a question like this: what level are you in coding? For example, you are asking different system developers to state their levels of coding. Levels, you can categorize them as the best, medium, and the worst. So you can arbitrarily assign numbers that make sense. For example, you can give the higher number for the best, then followed by the medium, then the worst. So you can say, you can assign, let's say, you say if it is the best, you give it 3. If it is for medium, you give it 2, and if it is for worst, then you give it what? 1. So for categorical scales, you give just the arbitrary numbers. But the rule is, the more positive the response is, or the higher or more advanced the categories of information, the higher the assigned number. So if you have the higher response, for example, here we have the best, then the best you give it higher number. The medium then is given a number that follows after that. So another guideline to make scoring easy, you can do a pre-assignment of numbers on the instrument to each response option. For example, you can have in your questionnaire, you could provide numbers just like that. You can say, let's say this 5 strongly agree. You give it 4, you say this is agree. Then if it is 3, you say this is undecided. If it is 2, you say this is disagree. So in your research instrument, you assign such numbers in each of the response options. Also, one more procedure that aid in the process of assigning scores to responses is to create what we call a codebook. Speaking of a codebook is the list of variables. It's the list of variables or questions that indicate how the researcher will code, or how the researcher would score responses from the instruments or checklist. So this is an example of a codebook. A codebook, as we have said, is a list of variables or questions that indicate how the researcher will code or score responses from the instruments or checklist. So in here, in your check, let's go back here. In your code book here, you see here you will put variable. So you say this is variable 1, variable 2, variable 3. Then in here you state the name of that variable. As you see here, the name of the variable, as you see here, the name of the variable is ID. Another name of the variable here is gender. And here you put the description plus the values, a description plus the values of such variable. For example, here we say this is variable 1, the name will be ID. The description says identification number assigned to each participant. So each participant will be given a number, and that number will range from 1 to 50 as it is seen there. Then the variable 2 represent gender. Description says that this is a sex of participant, that a 1 will represent a male and the 2 will represent a female. 1 will represent a male and 2 will represent a female. So that is how you prepare data for analysis. That is how you prepare data for analysis. But still in the process of preparing data for analysis, you will come to a point where you have to determine the types of scores. You will have to determine the type of scores to analyze. Before conducting analysis of scores, researchers consider what types of scores to use from their instrument. You need to say what type of scores are to be used in the instrument. What type of scores to be used in the instrument. This is important. Why? Because the type of score will affect how you will enter data into the computer file for analysis. And there are different types of scores. For example, you have single item score. In here, an individual scores assigned to each question for each participant in your study. So individual scores are assigned to each question for each participant in the study. These scores provide a detailed analysis of each person's response to each question on that instrument. For example, you have, let's say this is participant 1. You have, let's say participant 1. Participant 1 could have been asked, this is question 1 and this is question 2 and this is question 3. So the values of question 1, let's say this is 3, this is 4, this is 5. So these are each question. For each question, participant is scored or is assigned a certain value. So for example, in question 1 it is assigned a value which is 3, in question 2 is assigned the value which is 4, and in question 3 assigned the value which is what, which is 5. How about the summed item values? With the summed item values, scores of an individual added over several questions that measure the same variable. For example, you are given this question 1, question 2, question 3. They let's say they measure one single variable that is called the questions. So you can sum this question 1. So you say 3 plus 4 plus 5, then you assign it to a variable, let's say called the q. So this variable q then will be called the summed item score. Speaking of net item score, for example, there you had this participant 1 with the question 1, question 2, and the question 3. Let's say this has value of 2, this has value of 9, and this has value of 1. So scores when we're talking about net difference, scores in a quantitative study, they represent a difference or a change for each individual. For example, you could have a variable called z, and this variable called z is taken by taking the difference between question 2 and the question 3. So you will have 9 minus 1. So the score here that will be obtained will be called the net difference score. So that's what it means by types of scores. Then next, in the preparation of data for analysis, there is where you will select a statistical program. There is where you will select a statistical program. After you have scored the data, researchers select a computer program to analyze their data. There are some of these which are more frequently used programs. For example, we have one called Excel. We have one called Excel. We have another one called the SPSS. We have another one called the SAS and the System. So all these some of the computer programs that you can use for analysis. After you have selected a statistical program, then it is followed by inputting data. You input data in those computer programs. That is the next step, where you input your data from your instrument or from your checklist into the computer program. Inputting data occurs when the researcher transfers data from the responses on the instrument to the computer file for analysis. We will show this in the next episode when we will be talking about one or two of these statistical program and how we can input data and do the analysis for such data. So inputting data occurs when the researcher transfers the data from the response on the instrument to a computer file for doing what we call analysis. And in the preparation of data analysis, the last step is cleaning the data. The process of inspecting the data for scores, the scores of the data or the values that are outside of the accepted range, that is what we call cleaning the data. We inspect. For example, think of this. You had your question like you expected your user to enter values, let's say, for example, question about gender. Gender, you could say 1 represent a female and 2 represent a male. So suppose while entering the data in the computer program, one person entered, let's say, 3. So this value or this score is outside of the accepted range. The accepted range should either be 1 or 2. So such kind of unexpected values should be inspected and removed. How do you do now? What are the ways to accomplish this? You can do a visual inspection of the data grid to see if there are any values that are not they are outside of the accepted range. They are outside of the accepted range. Then after we have finished that first step of preparing data for analysis, now how do you do analysis of data? How do you analyze the data? After you have prepared and you have organized your data, then you are ready to analyze it. So you analyze the data so that you can address each one of your research questions. You are addressing each one of your research questions. As you remember, when we started these research process episodes, there were a point where we came to define research objectives. We defined the research objectives, and we converted these research objectives into research questions. We represented these objectives into research questions. So you analyze the data to address each of those research questions. So if you have 3 research questions, then you will have to analyze the first research question, then the second research question, then the third research questions. So speaking of that, we say questions or these hypotheses in the quantitative research, they require you to do the following. First of all, they may require you to describe trends in the data to a single variable or a question. They describe trends in the data to a single variable or a question on your instrument. For example, you are doing analysis, you are doing research to investigate the role of developers in development of information systems. For example, you have, let's say, an objective that is said like this. You want to find out the self-esteem of system developers. You want to find out the self-esteem of system developers. So the research question from this could be, what is the self-esteem of system developers? So to answer that research question, you need to utilize what we call descriptive statistics. These descriptive statistics, they indicate the following. They indicate general tendencies. And speaking of general tendencies of data, you are speaking of things like mean, you are speaking of things like median, and you are speaking of things like mode. So these are 3 important things are indicated in the general tendencies. Now Another thing that you can do with the descriptive statistics, the spread of scores. Speaking of spread of scores, you will measure things like variance and standard deviation and range. And again, in descriptive statistics, you can compare, you can do comparison of how one score relates to all other scores in a single variable. There is where you will find things like z-scores, you will find percentile ranks, etc. Or we might seek to describe any of our variables. For example, you can describe an independent variable, you can describe a dependent variable, or you can describe a control variable. You don't have to worry about what type of variable while you are describing trends of data in a single variable or in a single question on your instrument. So the first thing, as you want to address your research questions, you can do what we call descriptive statistics. Again, apart from descriptives, then you can compare two or more groups on the independent variable in terms of dependent variable. So you can do a kind of comparison. You can compare, let's say your research questions has on one side independent variable and on another side you have a dependent variable. So you can compare this independent variable in terms of dependent variable. For example, how do male developers and female developers compare in their self-esteem? So in this side here, you have the male developer and you have a female developer. These are the values. So they will represent what we call gender as a variable. So you compare this, you compare it with their self-esteem. You compare it with the self-esteem. So to answer that kind of a question, we need what we call inferential statistics. So it is inferential statistics where we can use it to compare two or more groups on independent variable in terms of dependent variable. Speaking of inferential statistics, we analyze data from a sample. To draw conclusion about an unknown population. That is what we call inferential statistics. What we do, we assess whether the differences of groups, here we are dealing with the means, or the relationship among variables is much greater or less than what we would expect for the total population if we could study the entire population. So as we are dealing with inferential statistics, at one point we have sample and at another point we have population. So we do all the testing in the sample and we expect we test it so that we can see if it would result into the same thing if we did the same test to the population. So that is what it means by inferential statistics. Another thing that we can do, if we relate two or more variables, here we also use inferential statistics. For example, we can have two variables. Let's say, does self-esteem relate to optimistic attitude by developers? So we have one side a variable that tests the self-esteem of developers, then another variable tests the optimistic attitude of the developers. So to answer that kind of a question, we use what we call inferential statistics. Another part while we are analyzing data is when we want to test hypotheses about the differences in the groups or the relationships of the variables. For example, we can ask, can male developers have higher self-esteem than female developers? That can be an hypothesis. So in order to test that, we need inferential statistics. To answer that questions, we also need inferential statistics. Now let's see how we can conduct descriptive analysis. Descriptive statistics is the one that will help you summarize the overall trends or the tendencies in your data to provide an understanding of how varied your scores might be and provide an insight into where one score stands in comparison with the others. So to accomplish that, we have the three ideas. We have the central tendency, where we find the mean, the mode, and the median, and we have the variability, where we find the variance, the standard deviation, and the range, and we have relative standing, where we find the z-scores and the percentile ranks. That is how we do we conduct descriptive analysis or descriptive statistics. But descriptive statistics help you analyze descriptive questions, but when you compare groups or you relate two or more variables, inferential analysis comes into play. Here, the basic idea is you have to look at the scores from a sample and use the result to draw inferences or make predictions about the whole population. Then in this case, often you can not study the entire population because the size and the and the cost. Because of the size and the cost, the size could result into higher cost. So instead, we examine a sample that has been carefully chosen from the population. But as we are doing inferential analysis, we have to understand what type of scales are we dealing with. For example, if you have a continuous independent variable and we have another variable which is continuous but it is dependent, there the type of inferential statistics that we should adopt are Pearson correlation and regression coefficient. Then if you have categorical variables which are independent and we have continuous variables which are dependent variables, here we go for a t-test, we go for analysis of variance, we call it ANOVA, and we go for analysis of covariance. But if you have one independent variable which is continuous and another dependent variable which is categorical, there you can go with the point by zero correlation. And if you have categorical independent variable and you have categorical dependent variable, there the two tests are the chi-square and the fill coefficient. How do you report results? Now, how do you report results in quantitative analysis? When researchers conclude the statistical testing, they next turn to represent the results in tables, in figures, and in reporting results in a discussion. So you might include these results in a section that is called results or findings. As you are writing your report, there may be a section which we call a results section or a presentation of findings section. So in the results section, it includes the tables. These tables are the ones that summarize the statistical information, or you can include figures where you can put the charts, the pictures, the drawings that in fact portray variables and their relationship, or you can provide detailed explanation about the statistical results. That is how you report your quantitative data after you have analyzed. Speaking of figures, you can represent with the bar charts, scatter plots, line graphs, charts, etc. Now, how do you present your results? You report whether, as you are presenting your results, you report whether the hypothesis test was significant or it was not significant. Then you provide some important information about the statistical tests. If you are given the statistics. Also, you include language that was typically used in reporting statistical results. So to finalize our episodes, now we will explain of how you can interpret the result. How do you interpret results? After you have reported and you have explained the detailed results, then researcher can conclude a study by summarizing the key findings. You summarize the key finding, then you develop some explanations for the results. Also, you suggest some limitations in the research and make recommendations for the future inquiries. There is where you can put summaries of major results, you can explain why results occurred, you can advance some limitations, and you can suggest for the future results. So Thank you very much for following Elimika Mtandaoni. This is your presenter Agustino Mogosi, and in the next episode we will be talking about qualitative data collection and qualitative data analysis. Thank you very much. Don't forget to subscribe, share and comment. Thank you.